Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With permission, I want to update the House on the disturbing unfolding developments in Iran. Horrific reports suggest that potentially thousands of people have been killed and many more arrested in the most brutal and bloody repression against public protest in Iran for at least 13 years. On the 28th of December, protests began on the streets of Iran following a plunge in the value of Iran's currency. Over the following week, the protests grew in scale, intensity and geographic spread. Crowds surged onto the streets from major cities to rural towns. Voices ranging from shopkeepers to university students protesting for change. Instead, they have been met with the most bloody repression. A total internet shutdown instigated by the Iranian regime from the 8th of January, together with restrictions on phone communications, means that the full facts are not yet clear. But I am fearful that the reports that we have seen may underestimate the full scale of the horror as further evidence and testimony reaches the outside world. Videos are still emerging, including of what appear to be protester corpses lined up in body bags outside a hospital in the outskirts of Tehran. The Iranian regime has called for a 3-day period of national mourning, but only for its security forces. No acknowledgement of dead protesters. Instead, the regime peddles its manufactured narrative of foreign manipulation and seeks to portray peaceful protesters as criminals and terrorists, all the while pursuing a brutal and relentless crackdown on its own people. It takes huge bravery to protest and to speak out in the face of this oppression, especially for women who continue to face and endure severe repression in their daily lives. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the United Kingdom condemns in the strongest of terms the horrendous and brutal killing of Iranian protesters, and we demand that the Iranian authorities respect the fundamental rights and freedoms of their citizens. On Friday, the Prime Minister joined with the German Chancellor and the French President in condemnation of this violence and to call for an end to the violence. It is a message that I have also delivered directly to the Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi yesterday, setting out the UK's total abhorrence at the killing and the repression that we are seeing, urging them to immediately end the violence today. As the further reports have come through, the Minister to underline the gravity of this moment and the horrific reports that we are hearing. It is no aberration, it is no outlier, rather it is all too in keeping with the fundamental nature and track record of this regime. Consistent with its previous conduct towards its own people, as we saw during the lethal repression of protesters in custody of Mahsa Amini at the hands of Iran's so-called morality police. Or consistent with its destabilising actions towards its neighbours in the region, as we have seen in its backing of terrorist and extremist proxies of Hezbollah, of Hamas, of the Houthis, and from Iran's barrage of missile attacks on Israel. And consistent too with Iran's malign global impact, whether it be in terms of weapons support for Russia against Ukraine or its nuclear programme. And consistent too with Iran's state threats activities on UK soil, posing danger to dissidents, journalists and the Jewish community here in the UK, with more than 20 potentially lethal Iran-backed plots over the last year alone, as tracked through the vital work of the UK's security agencies. So let me set out the action that the government is taking in coordination with allies in response to this consistent threat that the Iranian regime poses to the stability, security and freedom and to the UK national interest. First, on domestic security threats, we will not tolerate any Iran-backed threats on UK soil. In May, 3 Iranian nationals were charged with offences linked to the Iranian regime under the National Security Act in 2023, and I want to thank the police, security and intelligence services for their tireless work to keep us safe. Last year, we placed Iran on the enhanced tier of the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme to detect, deter and disrupt malign and undeclared efforts to undermine our democracy. We sanctioned the criminal Foxtrot network for the violent threats it posed against Jewish and Israeli targets in Europe on behalf of the Iranian regime. And we have geared up the UK's security infrastructure to better tackle hybrid threats. As Home Secretary, I commissioned the review by the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, Jonathan Hall, KC, into what more needed to be done so that we could apply counter-terrorism style powers, including on prescription, to state-backed threats as well. And we announced last year that the government will take forward the recommendations so we can deal with all the UK-based threats that we face. Second, support for British citizens. Madam Deputy Speaker, the first duty of any government is the safety and security of our citizens, and my department is working tirelessly to ensure the safety of British nationals in Iran. I spoke yesterday with the leader in Tehran about the vital work that he and the team are doing on the ground. Relevant Iranian authorities regarding detained British nationals, and their welfare in Iran remains a priority. We are, of course, deeply concerned that Craig and Lindsay Foreman have been charged with espionage in Iran, and just yesterday, Minister Faulkner met with members of the Foreman family, and we continue to raise this case directly with the Iranian authorities. Third, the coordinated economic and diplomatic pressure on this regime. This government and our predecessors have continually raised human rights violations in Iran through the UN and international forums, including most recently, this autumn, resolutions calling for an end to the regime's reprisals against women, against journalists, and against human rights campaigners. But then in October, alongside our E3 partners, France and Germany, the UK triggered the snapback process, which saw the reinstatement of 6 previously terminated UN sanctions resolutions on Iran. We did so because of the repeated failure by the Iranian regime to comply with its nuclear commitments. On the 1st of October, we updated domestic legislation to reapply extensive sanctions measures contained in these resolutions, also going further by designating 71 individuals and entities in sectors which have links to Iran's nuclear programme. Overall, this government has imposed over 220 Iran sanctions designations since coming into office. And we are backing strong sanctions enforcement. Just last week, the UK provided support to the US's seizure of Bella 1, accused of shadow fleet activities and Iran sanctions breaches. And at the time when the sanctions were reinstated in October, I also urged the Iranian regime, even then, to change their approach, to work with the international community to comply with their obligations. I told them then that it would take time, and during that window they should start compliance and engagement with the international community and obfuscation. They have not done so. Weapons inspectors still have not been given access, and far from changing their approach, we have seen instead a reversion to the most brutal forms of repression on their own streets. As a result, I can confirm the UK will bring forward legislation to implement full and further sanctions and sectoral measures. The UK has already designated key players in Iran's oil, energy, nuclear and financial systems. Further measures will target finance, energy, transport, software and other significant industries which are advancing Iranian nuclear escalation. And we will work further with the EU and other partners to explore what additional measures might now be needed in response to developments. And I also send a message to other countries who have sought to avoid implementing UN sanctions or to undermine the legitimacy of the UN sanctions reinstated following the snapback process, because no one should be supporting the kind of approach the Iranian regime is currently taking, and all member states should be fulfilling their UN obligations on such a grave and serious issue. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me say something else about the events in recent days. Just as they did in 2022, it's absolutely clear that the Iranian regime are trying to paint these protests as the result of foreign influence and instigation. They're using that accusation to try and whip up opposition to the protests amongst anti-Western Iranians and try to justify their vicious and sickening attacks on the ordinary civilians marching in the streets. These are nothing but lies and propaganda being spread by a desperate regime. They must not be allowed to undermine a genuine grassroots movement, drawing together people from all parts of Iranian society and spreading across multiple cities and regions. And that is why we and other governments across the world are determined not to play into the hands of the regime or to allow our words or actions to be twisted to support their lies and propaganda. And with a functioning embassy on the ground in Tehran and British nationals being held in Iranian jails, previous governments have always done. To tackle Iranian threats at home and abroad than any recent government, and we have done so with broad cross-party support. That must continue. The world is watching Iran, and the UK will continue to confront the regime's lies, to call out its repression, and to take the steps necessary to protect the UK's interests. I commend this statement to the House.
I call